Thank you all for coming this morning. I don't know how familiar you are with the organization For the Good of Illinois. It was founded by Adam Andrzejewski, and Adam Andrzejewski ran for governor. That was the campaign I was the policy director of. He has an advisory role for the Good of Illinois now, but he runs something called the For the Good of Illinois PAC, and I am the executive director of For the Good of Illinois, which is a 501c4 nonprofit, and our goal is open government transparency, show people what your government is doing in the hopes that the rational citizens of a decent society will do something to limit government. And when I talk about the Constitution, or when you think about anything in the Constitution Day and something important as this document, you really understand the power and importance of those two simple words: limited government. And as you take that concept and spread it out, it spreads out to so many other things that become so important. But what I'm going to talk about today, especially when you have experts like Professor Gleicher, I'm not really going to try to pretend I'm more of an expert on the U.S. Constitution than he is. Like many people who call themselves conservatives, I read the Constitution, I read articles about the Constitution. I think I understand the Constitution probably better than some people who would be on the opposite political divide of the conservatives. But most importantly, you think about what it means to limit government. And what I'm going to talk about today is the difference between the United States Constitution, which in theory limits government, and the Illinois Constitution, which in practice does not. The Illinois Constitution, I would make the case, and I have made the case in my book that I wrote. And I rushed out today too fast to go grab a box of what was once 3,000 copies that I had in my garage, and bring a copy all with you. It is outdated at this point because the book, Illinois Deserves Better, the ironclad case for an Illinois Constitutional Convention, was written about the 2008 vote, which comes up every 20 years. I believe it should come up every 2. But it comes up every 20 years of whether or not we should have a constitutional convention in Illinois. And I was one of the few people on the quote-unquote conservative side of the aisle who believed that it was a wonderful opportunity to improve this state dramatically. Conservatives, appropriately so, and quite frankly, I think Americans appropriately so, across the political spectrum, but I think conservatives possibly more so than liberals, I'm speaking very generally here, revere constitutions. And like I said, that's an appropriate thing to do. I would make the case, however, that the Illinois Constitution is not worth reverence. The U.S. Constitution was born out of the lack of workings of the Articles of Confederation, and some very, very smart people at a very, very interesting crucible of time devised this amazing document, which I'm sure everything in the world can be improved upon somehow, but in today's day and age, I don't think many of us would want to take the risk of having a U.S. Constitutional Convention with the problem that the culture and the people these days might actually not improve upon it, but make it much, much worse. The Illinois Constitution, on the other hand, and in my opinion, and I'm happy to debate this with anybody, hopefully I won't have to debate it in another 18 years, when the vote comes up again, because we'll be able to do something about it sooner. But the Illinois Constitution deserves no such reverence. It was born at a time when a powerful Republican Cook County boss and a powerful Democrat Chicago mayor, both of whom had a tremendous amount of clout in their respective camps, decided that we should have a constitutional convention, put it on the ballot for the sole purpose of literally giving birth to what I consider today's version of Illinois government, which I call a kleptocracy. And I would make the case that while you could argue that it's not the Constitution, it's the quality of the people, and it's not this, there's various debates you can have inside here, and not everybody who agrees with me is entirely wrong. Most of them are, but disagrees with me is entirely entirely wrong, but the fact is, this is a very bad Constitution. And it is worth editing and changing, whether through amendments or through conventions. A couple of simple examples. The U.S. Constitution, as we have in our wonderful little handout here, 9th and 10th Amendment, very clear, if not in their direct express opinion, as Professor Gleischer mentioned, do, at least implicitly, limit the power of the government and say, well, burden of proof, for lack of a better term, of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And then the 10th Amendment, obviously, powers not delegated to the U.S. Constitution by the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states, are reserved for the states respectively, or the people. Article 2 of the Illinois Constitution says, enumeration in this court of specified powers and functions shall not be construed as a limitation on the powers of the state. These are subtle things, but they matter. And you could, of course, make the case, and I concede the point, that the U.S. Constitution was a very broad national document to create a nation, and if, in a reading of the 10th Amendment, you could actually say, well, the states do have a right to claim powers because they are entities under the Constitution, and therefore they have the right to claim powers under there. One case that always comes up is the U.S. Constitution is silent on education, but almost every state constitution is not. And it says that the Constitution says in one way, shape, or form, the state shall take care of the public education system. So I'm not saying that this, the Article 2, Section 2 of the Illinois Constitution is unwarranted or unconstitutional relative to the federal Constitution. I'm just saying it states right there at the beginning of the document that, in the balance of power, when the justices or somebody is deciding something about the Illinois Constitution, the presumption is that the state should have powers. Another example, and the funny thing is my internet connection on my fancy Galaxy tab here stopped on me, which means my phone shut off or something. But
once they disconnected the show,
exactly. So I'm not going to be able to go to it exactly, but another example is the Illinois Constitution section on local government about home rule. And at the very end of that section, there's a nice little sentence that says, the powers of the local government, or the powers of home rule, shall be construed liberally. Well, good question. It was asked, what does that mean? What it does, it puts, again, the presumption that whatever the home rule unit wants to do, whether it means to, take away, under like Chicago, potentially take away some of your First Amendment, Second Amendment rights, or whether it wants to tax you in a certain way, or whether it wants to borrow more than it should, or whether it oversteps some bounds of some statute, that the justices, the Supreme Court and the appellate court justices in Illinois, they read that clause of the Constitution and said, oh, well, the powers of home rule units are to be construed liberally. And, Article 2, enumeration in this Constitution of specified powers and functions, shall not be construed as a limitation on the powers of the state. So, the government wins, and the citizens lose.
So what you're saying is two political bosses...
two political bosses
cut a deal...
wrote a Constitution...
So they could have a legal racket.
They wrote a Constitution that empowers what I think most of us in Illinois would call the combine, or a combine, but more accurately empowers bossism. Empowers local politicians, your trustees, your mayors, and whatever it is they do. And you can kind of go back and read it from the 1960s and late 60s and 70s when this thing was written. The idea that the power resides in the people, or that the people have something to say, is expressly discussed in the constitutional notes as something that they were trying to tamp down or avoid. Heaven forbid you give those crazed peasants with pitchforks the opportunity to limit government. You can go, again, the third example I'll give, and I think there's tons of examples in here, the virtual inability to change the Constitution. Who gets to change it? Well, the legislators can change it anytime they want by a 3/5 majority of both houses, putting something on the ballot, and once it's on the ballot, then a majority of the people, it crisscrosses in two different situations. If 2/3 of the legislators put it on the ballot, it requires a simple majority, but in the terms of the constitutional, no, not in the Constitutional Convention, but in other ones, ratification requires a vote of 60% of the people for a 3/5 majority. And these are examples of where they made it almost impossible. People sit there and say, well, if we want to have a taxpayer bill of rights that limits government spending, we should just put that on the ballot and change our Constitution. The vast majority of people in Illinois have no idea that you can't do that. You cannot change the Constitution in Illinois. Now, in fairness, the U.S. Constitution is very, very difficult to amend. And I would make the case that that's arguably a good idea, and it has been amended. Are there days I wish it was easier to amend? Yeah, but at the same time, I'm glad that if I would like to amend it, and my side would like to amend it, just let's think about if it were easy to amend some of the things some of our opponents would have done to our Constitution, our U.S. Constitution. So there's a valid argument as to whether a Constitution should be easily changed or not. The Illinois Constitution, the only article that can be changed by referendum is the legislative article. And the drafters of the Illinois Constitution, in their infinite lack of wisdom, had this idea that, well, everything else the legislature can change if they want to amend it, but the one thing they might not want to amend is the legislative article because that's what they have control and powers over. So we will let the citizens amend the legislative article of the Constitution through the ballot initiative. But then, of course, you have the other thing that goes on in Illinois is you have a Constitution that empowers local government, empowers those who want to spend and tax, empowers bosses and government officials at the expense of the citizens' power. So whether for those of you who have had experience with our election laws, our ballot access laws, all of the different things you can try and do, even though you have this theoretical ability to amend Article 4, then you have a justice system and an appellate court system that so tightly construes the way this Constitution is written in Article 4. And one of the portions of the Constitution that talk about amending the legislative article that talks about our legislators and how the houses are put together, it says that the fourth example, it says that any change to the legislative article must be both structural and procedural. Well, so a few years ago, they put on they got plenty of signatures. It was well funded. It was a term limits initiative to put term limits on the legislature. And the justices looked at that and they said, well, term limits are arguably procedural and how long someone can serve, but not really. And they're certainly not structural because they don't really change the structure. They only change how long somebody can serve. So this ballot initiative is unconstitutional. And no, you ridiculous, crazy, peasants with pitchfork citizens, you do not have the right to vote on term limits in the legislative article. And that is the mindset of the people who wrote this Constitution, which is very, very different from the people who wrote the U.S. Constitution and the crucible in which it was born and the people who did it. So with that in mind, I want to kind of segue a little bit to what I would consider important constitutional issues that are, quite frankly, extra-constitutional. We are blessed to live in this country with a set of laws that are relatively clear, that if properly taught are relatively transparent as to what the system we live under entails. But then you come to this issue about, well, what if they just ignore the Constitution? I would make the case, for example, one of the laws, and this was actually just adjudicated through a chain of court cases, Wickard v. Filburn from the 30s. And this was, you've probably heard about this story if you've been following the healthcare debate of Obamacare and then that court decision. But Wickard v. Filburn was the case that said, well, a man's growing corn on his own property for his own use, and he said, you can't regulate my plot of corn. I'm not selling it in interstate commerce. I'm using it only for my own purposes, so it's not interstate commerce. And the court basically said, well, if you grow it, you don't have to buy it. And since you don't have to buy it, you are having an impact on someone in interstate commerce who might be selling it. Therefore, the corn you grow on your land is interstate commerce, and yes, we can regulate it. Now, you can debate that reasoning. I certainly do. But, the fact is that the fact that you're sitting there means that you're not at McDonald's buying breakfast, and therefore you are impacting interstate commerce. And if McDonald's can hire enough legislators to pass a law, they should be able to regulate interstate commerce and make sure that none of us are here this morning, but we should actually be serving McDonald's and be there because our sitting here this morning is impacting interstate commerce. Well, look at the law and decide. Interestingly enough, this is what Obamacare was about. Can we force you to buy an insurance product? Just as an aside, I'm not a fan of the outcome, as I imagine most of the people in this room would not be. But interestingly enough, when I read what Roberts wrote, I actually think he did us a favor through the back door by basically creating language by which citizens could begin the process of overturning Wickard v. Filburn. He literally put language in that case, in that decision, that said this is an improper law under the Commerce Clause, literally limiting Commerce Clause expansion for as long as that decision is followed, until it's overturned. Now, under the taxing power, we should be able to tax you if you're not eating at McDonald's. You should pay a tax for coming here. We can tax you for buying this product and not that product. We can tax Lexuses and Volkswagens like crazy because you're not buying government motors. So I'm not saying that the court decision was a good one. I'm just saying I think Justice Roberts did us a little tiny backdoor favor by limiting the Commerce Clause. But was that following the Constitution? You could make the case that it was. I would make the case that it was a massive overreach in the 30s of government power. The same one, and this is actually one of the most egregious examples I think most of us could imagine, but it is McCain-Feingold. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Clearly, and the professor laid this out very well for us, this was specifically, if nothing else, to protect political speech. That I could walk into a parking lot and start saying vote socialist or vote communist or vote Constitution Party or all this other stuff, that I could stand up on any soapbox, and also that through friends and relatives and acquaintances and campaign donations, I would have the right to impact political speech. And here Congress, and I despise John McCain for this, despite the fact that I voted for him given the alternative, but I despise the man for this, and Feingold as well, that they specifically limited political speech 60 days before an election. And George Bush stinking signed it. And a majority of Supreme Court justices ratified it. Now, I'm not calling for an overthrow of the U.S. government, but I could make the case that every single person who voted for, signed, and ratified in court McCain-Feingold broke their constitutional oath to protect the Constitution of the United States. Now, you could debate that with me, but that's what I think they did. So, this comes back to what, a message on a day like today, what do we really have to go on when we talk about documents like the Constitution? And one of my favorite quotes that this comes back to, and I think it might be the beginning of coming back down to a foundation to how we might reverse the process of what's going on in this country. Hopefully we can. Is my favorite founding father, and I have a high opinion of all of them, but my favorite founding father is John Adams. Just because he was so cantankerous and didn't mind poking his finger in people's eyes and speaking the truth. Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Those are pretty strong words. And I'm sure our atheist friends would horribly disagree with it, because there's no reason why our religious people should be moral people, and moral people have to be, God doesn't exist and all this other stuff. And there may be believers who still think, no, that's too strong a statement. The Constitution has worked just fine. I would argue that the Constitution and the erosion that we're seeing is a direct reflection in the erosion of the electorate that elects the leaders who supposedly manage our government and supposedly uphold the Constitution. The Constitution, no matter how brilliant, no matter how good it is, I think John Adams was saying, it's really only as good as the people who are putting others in office and the leaders that are there and the people who are voting for it. And I think that that's true. So where I'm going with this, and what I think is so important for a Constitution Day discussion, and also a discussion with our friends and relatives and our children and grandchildren, is that you can't avoid having to be a moral actor in this world. And if you try, you are actually doing your society a disservice. We have to become more active in upholding our Constitution. I think, I don't agree with everything Glenn Beck says, but the fact that he's making the Constitution such a key part of his repertoire and his discussion, I think, is important. And I think it's fascinating as we start talking about the Constitution. We have former congressmen like Phil Hare caught on videotape when asked about Obamacare saying things like, I don't care about the Constitution. I mean, we need to get more of these people on record to say such stupid things so we can start tossing them out of office. So it basically comes down to this, and I use this on my radio show, and I talk to people quite often about it. If you were to take an arc of people, and, 1,000 women, 1,000 men, put them on a spaceship, put them in suspended animation, and send them off to some planet somewhere to start a new civilization. The only two things you really need, and I call it a civilization in a box, are the 10 Amendments and the 10 Commandments. And that's not to take away the many, many well-drafted things that are in the body of the Constitution. But I keep on trying to tell people this. If you want a good civilization, and this is something that works for our side, because almost every progressive and every liberal I've ever talked to is nodding their head yes when you start talking to them this way. And one of my other favorite sayings is, when you accept a person's premises, you are bound eventually to accept their arguments. And this gets our potential political opponents on our turf, on our premises, which they, in fact, themselves agree with for the most part. And that is this. The 10 Commandments, leaving aside, religious Judeo-Christian backing, the 10 Commandments are basically saying, well, I promise not to kill other people. I promise that there's something above myself. The first commandment. You can take all these things and basically say the 10 Commandments are a social contract between your own morality and the society around you to say, I will comport myself as a decent person and not defraud and covet and steal and kill my neighbors. And that is, quite frankly, it's a self-limitation. It's a limitation on the massive egos and ids that we have running around our consciousness that says, I want to do everything and take everything and do all this. We say to ourselves, I'm going to stop myself from hurting other people or doing this. And that's an essential part of a civilization. Another essential part of a civilization is no matter what governments we institute, they have limits. That they can't quarter soldiers in our home. They can't take away our right to assemble. They can't take away our right to defend ourselves. They can't put us in prison without due process. And I call the Ten Commandments and the Ten Amendments a civilization in the box. It's like a conceptual walking constitution for a just society. And as we look at what's going on in the world, we kind of see that potential of more and more just societies developing around us, and we also can see the threats that might take that away. And that's why we have to be vigilant. So I'll just close with this. On this Constitution Day, become very conscious of what's a good Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, and what's a bad one, Illinois. Don't just sit there and say, oh, it's a Constitution, it deserves reverence. Read it, discern what it does, and say, no, 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 this one can change. We can change this Constitution, and we deserve the right to. To do that, I would caution all, and the fact that we're here on a Saturday morning, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I would say that we should become more aggressive with our friends, relatives, acquaintances, and neighbors, that there's no opt-out strategy. You can't just sit there and say, I vote every 2 years, so everything's fine, I don't have to do this. I don't think we have the option to opt out of politics at this moment. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, you could understand a person who was on his farm or in his business or doing something and saying, I don't really have to worry about voting. The culture looks okay, and not voting is a valid option in terms of what you may want to do. I would make the case that while certainly it's a valid option for those people who decide not to vote, it's becoming an increasingly dangerous option when you look at the quality of people that we're putting into power, quite frankly, in both parties. So I don't think opting out is a strategy. As people who come to a Constitution Day event on a Saturday morning, even a particularly nice one, we need to become more aggressive, and that leads me to my second point. I believe we need to become similar to Glenn Beck, in our own way, constitutionally evangelical. Do you understand this document? Do you understand what it does for us? And do you understand what will happen if we lose it? And, you know, somebody just rolls their eyes and says, oh, you crazy Tea Partiers, you're just all nuts, or you're a Republican, you're engaging in a war on women. Don't talk to me about a Constitution. Some people may react that way. But the fact of the matter is, I think more and more people are waking up to how important it is. And I think we're at a point in history where we can really, really make inroads with previously uninterested people just by grabbing them by the lapel and say, listen to us, you're in the process of losing your country, that's the bad news. The good news is, with just a little bit more action, and a little bit more knowledge, and a little bit more perseverance, we are poised to rapidly shift things back in a better direction, in my view. And that's why on any given day, I'm either horribly pessimistic or horribly optimistic that we actually have a pretty good future. And on that, I'll take questions. Thank you very much.